Greetings and welcome once again to Aspects of Aliyah, and it's been very interesting these last few sessions as we've looked at the whole issue of war. A friend of mine said to me, why are you teaching on war at such great length? What's that got to do with Aliyah? Well, the answer is very straightforward. Israel is in the middle of a great conflict with Iran and its proxies. As Christians, and Christians who care, and Christians who are involved in the Aliyah process, we need to understand what it is. People have said to me, why are you encouraging people to go back to a place where there's ever threat of violence and bombing and so on? Well, the answer is quite straightforward. The Jewish people want to go to Israel, despite all those things. And because of the events in Europe, Germany and Holland and UK in the past 10 days, there's no future for Jewish people in Europe. And I'm saying that with heart of love. The chief rabbi of France has told all Jewish people to leave. Well, the chief rabbi in Holland has told all the people, Jewish people, to leave. And in England, and UK here, Jewish people are leaving at a rate we've never seen before. But it's interesting to know the background to all of these things. And when you question about the conflict in the Middle East and why people are going there, we need to understand the situation. Even if questions that you ask might seem misguided or unnecessary, a legitimate question deserves a legitimate answer. And more so, it requires an informed answer. So, we've looked at just war. How about just peace? That's a good one, isn't it? We mentioned it, didn't we? Just war theories. Do they have any real value? But there's an even bigger problem in one sense. What about just peace? So I want to introduce you today to just peacemaking theory. Something you've probably not thought about or even heard of. In addition to ethical dimensions of war, there are also ethical dimensions concerning peace. At the outset, it's important to consider what is both meant and understood by peace. Peace may be understood in two entirely different ways. Firstly, there's what I'm going to term negative peace, which simply refers to the absence of violence, generally brought about by violent methods such as military destruction, coercion, and economic measures. In international terms, peace is considered to exist during a period of cessation of violence and hostilities, or as Thucydides, right on the Peloponnesian War, 500 years before New Testament times, says peace is only a space during war. And many military historians do consider that peace is only a temporary measure within the historical process between various lands. It was considered there would never be any more wars in Europe, or in the Western world, so to speak, following World War II. Wrong. But we won't go into. We're not going to speak about Russian-Ukraine war. But let me tell you that our work in Ukraine is still going. Jewish people are still being rescued from Donbass and the other areas. And our brave workers, at great personal risk, are rescuing Jewish people out of that awful situation in the Russian-Ukrainian war. Good to know that. So, what is peace? Negative peace. Yeah, a cessation of hostilities. But negative peace is invariably non-sustainable and may well provide the seedbed for future conflict in the future. Now, the second way of defining peace is positive peace. Positive peace, which really reflects the Hebrew term shalom. Now, shalom's a great word, isn't it? As well as being hello and all the rest of it. Shalom, the term implies rest, wholeness, and well-being, and thus, by extension, reconciliation and restoration. Where reconciliation is not possible, separation and resolution may be possible with a minimum of hostility and acrimony. Now, those who follow just peacekeeping theory that I'm going to explain to you now like this idea, and this is why they push for a two-state solution. 83% of Americans in a poll in November last year support a two-state solution. I personally don't think the Bible does, but that's what the poll said. This same poll actually revealed some other things. That most people take the news off the television and make opinions from TV broadcast. And it's said that the influence of church and Christian leaders is only 12% in the first case and 10% in the second in opinion making. I find that quite frightening. However, just peacemaking theory is an expression of ethical principles affirmed by, I'm going to say, a Christian identity. The idea of this whole concept was really originally raised by the Catholics and the Presbyterians, who suddenly realised in the 1970s that the idea of war and peace had never really been looked at theologically since Thomas Aquinas. And we all know how long ago that was, in the medieval period, of course. So, we're going to say a Christian identity, whichever label you like to put on yourself, whether you're a Baptist, Methodist, Episcopalian, Anglican, Catholic, Pentecostal, whatever you are. So we'll just say any Christian identity, because of course, interdenominational disputes with all the hills, no one Christian body agrees with another one entirely, and that's just the nature of human beings, I suppose. However, the question is, what are the foundations of such an opinion? Opinions are just peacemaking. Some Christians recognise a source of just peacemaking principles to be revelation concerned within the canonical scriptures. Others regard them as a discernment of the moral law of the universe, or the logic of moral discourse, or take them as grounded in studies of the historical process and events that have led to peace. Therefore, ipso facto, most base their just peacemaking theory upon some combination of scriptural, philosophical, and historical empirical sources. Do these three things sit together comfortably? Will be my first question. So, just peacemaking theory Christian, was pioneered by the American ethicist and Baptist theologian Glenn Stasser of Fuller Seminary, along with a group of 23 Christian ethicists and scholars of international relations, specialists in conflict resolution. Some theologians, they never told us how many that is, which I found quite interesting. A Christian ethicist isn't necessarily a theologian. It could be a sociologist, a psychologist, any number of ologists. Thing that rather surprised me, one New Testament scholar. One New Testament scholar, and a handful of leaders from activist identities of various stripes. So together the group worked over a period of 5 years to create just peacemaking theory that is largely accepted within the evangelical world, and very much so in Catholicism. So just war theory evaluates the rightness or wrongness of a policy to make war. Glenn Stasser proposed that just peacemaking theory is an evaluation of the adequacy of a government's initiatives or lack of initiatives to make peace. Well, I think we're in a problem in the Middle East before we even start, aren't we? On this very first one, the adequacy of a government's initiative or lack of initiatives to make peace. Let's just keep that in the back of our head as we go along, shall we? The ideas how to approach peace initially gained traction amongst Catholic scholars who felt, as I said, that thought was still locked into the work of Thomas Aquinas, who based his ideas on the patristic works of the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries. In their pastoral letter, The Challenge of Peace, in 1983, the US Catholic bishops, when they worked more or less the way they were going with this, said this: recognition of the Church's responsibility to join with the call today to develop a theology of peace. They want recognition of this. Much of the history of Catholic theology of war and peace has focused on limiting the resort to force in human affairs. This task is still necessary, but is not a sufficient response. The Protestant Church also paid very little attention to what happens after a war. But in the height of the Cold War, the question began to be raised as the shadow of a worldwide nuclear catastrophe, and the campaign for nuclear disarmament became a matter of widening interest. If you were around in the late 60s, 70s and 80s, there was a big peace movement, big campaigns for nuclear disarmament, anti-Vietnam, war demonstrations, all kinds of things. So, same year, the Office of the General Assembly at the Presbyterian Church, USA, responded to the challenge in this way. The Church in the nuclear age must shift its energies from considerations of just war to the urgent and primary task of defining and serving a just peace. A nuclear stalemate or even elimination of nuclear arms is still far from God's shalom. That's a good notion. Shalom is the intended state of the entire human race. It involves the well-being of the whole person in all relationships, personal, social, and cosmic. Shalom means life in a community of compassion, order marked by social and economic justice. Peace without justice is no peace. That is why the Bible so often reflects God's special concern for the poor and the powerless. So far, so good. The great Bible vision of global peace soars into plowshares. Every family under its own vine tree are fundamental to thinking about peace. I'm rather interested about sitting on your own vine tree, because it says in the Old Testament everybody sat under their own vine tree, pleasing themselves what they did. Interesting thought. But then again, maybe I'm a little bit picky. There you go. I'm sure they meant well. Search of peace is ultimately God's gift. We need to avoid the proud illusion that we can create it by human effort alone. Christian obedience demands we move towards that peace in all possible ways, by extending the rule of law, advocating human rights, strengthening the organs of international order, working for common security and economic justice, converting industry to peaceful production, rather than making defensive weapons. I assume the meaning there. Increasing the standard of reconciliation with those we identify as enemies. Very idealistic, good-hearted, but let's just think about this a bit more. So, the principles of just peacemaking will come to when we return.
If you are a Christian, then there is no question that you owe a great debt to the Jewish people. Unto them were entrusted the oracles of God. What does that mean? It means, if not for the faithfulness of the Jewish people, we would not have this. And therefore you would not know your God, and you would not know his Son.
Israel and the Jewish people are under attack right now, and we owe them everything. The least that we can do is support them in their hour of need. So please go to EzraInternational.org and give to the Emergency Relief Fund, and your dollars will be used to help displaced and traumatized Jewish people throughout the land.
And remember, if you do nothing, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jewish people from another place. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Please go to EzraInternational.org and give your best gift today.
Welcome back. So, the principles of just peacemaking. Firstly, non-violent direct action. This occurs when citizens confront injustice through lobbying, peaceful public protests, protest marches, strikes, and other resistance strategies, including boycotts and strategic non-cooperation. That sounds to me like BDS. Okay, effective non-violent direct action campaigns are supposed to be capable of drawing or at times pressuring recalcitrant governments, shall we say, and sometimes other powers, into reassessing and changing policy. So, in light of this idea, it could be said in one sense the need for a theory developed from a sense of inadequacy of debate between just war and pacifism. And this really, I think, is where problems in just peacemaking really start to bifurcate, and thus end up not making a great deal of sense in some ways. So, JPT focuses on initiatives focused on reducing international civil tension and private actions or actions by private citizens. I can actually give you one example where this has actually worked. In the 1970s, myself and the team were working in communist East Germany, and I had a great privilege of meeting Rolf Heidel, who was a Protestant pastor. And in the 1970s, at the Nikolai Kirche in central Leipzig, they started a prayer meeting for the fall of communism and for peace, world peace. The gathering spawned peace prayers every Monday at 5 o'clock. And the meeting in communist East Germany, where the Stasi were the worst secret police of any, let me tell you, from personal experience, 2,000 people met to pray. Then it spilled out into the streets, candlelight processions. And on May the 8th, 1989, repressive measures were taken against these candlelight marches, prayer vigils, and prayer meetings. But by September in 1989, the 2,000 seats of Nikolai Kirche flowed over with uncounted tens of thousands in the streets, and 300,000 people marched past the headquarters of the Stasi. The rest of this day is history. I was on the border of Poland and East Germany on the night that happened. When it fell, all the lights went off at the border crossing. All the guards went home. It was eerie. But be encouraged. Non-direction strikes, all these sort of things, yeah, we've talked about those. Well, but there is one thing that works, and that is mass prayer. Let me encourage you. Just peacemaking theory is not about strikes and protest marches, such as about prayer. prayer vigils, marches to say that Yeshua is indeed Lord. So, cooperative conflict resolution is the next one, best understood as initiatives for establishing partners in peace. The idea of cooperation conflict resolution is that both sides come and sit down together in a manner to establish something that's at least satisfactory to both parties involved. The realism, of course, is that if either party is unsatisfied, then both parties suffer because the conflict festers. I mean, the mere idea of a massive Hezbollah sitting down with a nice cup of tea and discussing with Israel what they're going to do, quite frankly, defies my imagination. Please excuse my slightly cynical streak as we go through these things. So for this to work, the first prerequisite, of course, is an active partnership, not passive cooperation. Adversaries should listen to each other and attempt to empathise with other people's perspectives, including their culture, spirituality, their own anthropology, history, and the emotions that rise from all these things. So, what do we make of this idea of conflict resolution? The 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, in his 1989 Nobel lecture, commented that peace, in the sense of absence of war, is of little value to someone who's dying of hunger or cold. It will not remove the pain of torture inflicted on a prisoner. It does not comfort those who have lost their loved ones in floods caused by senseless deforestation in a neighbouring country. Peace can only last where human rights are respected, where people are fed, and individuals and nations are free. What hope have we got of cooperative conflict resolution when there's a clash of culture, faith, ethics, and commonality? Acknowledging responsibility. First state of reconciliation, conflict resolution, if you want, is an acknowledgement of responsibility. First stage to acknowledge responsibility for conflict and injustice, both from repentance and seeking forgiveness where appropriate. Addressing past offences, real or implied on occasion, even if imagined, are important steps in establishing a foundation for a peaceful relationship. Does this work? Are there examples of it? Well, yes. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a court-like restorative justice body assembled in South Africa in 1996 after the end of the apartheid. The Truth and I can only get this out, so I'm windy. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created to investigate gross human rights violations that were perpetuated during the time 1960 1994. They included abductions, killings, and torture. Now, this wasn't one-sided. Things happened on both sides involved. And, of course, there was always a big conflict. Was Nelson Mandela a great peacemaker, or was he just another terrorist, basically, who became legit? I'll leave that to you to make your own mind up about. But his mandate covered violations by both the state liberation movements. And controversially, the TRC was empowered to grant amnesty to perpetrators as long as they can confess the crimes truthfully and faithfully. They took the testimony of 21,000 victims. 2,000 of them were called to appear at public hearings, and they received 7,112 amnesty applications, in which case 849 cases were granted and 5,392 refused, and the rest were withdrawn. Was that of any value? Maybe. Promote democracy, human rights, and religious liberty speaks for itself. It's difficult to do that in Iran because if you're not a Shia Muslim, then your life's not worth living. If you're a Sunni Muslim in other parts, your life's not worth living. If you're a Christian in Nigeria, in parts, you've got no justice, and so it goes on. Foster just and sustainable economic development speaks for itself, and I've got to admit that certainly economic development of countries in some countries has helped, whereas it's actually just provided more economy and strength for terrorist organisations. The UN being the worst culprits of the wrongful distribution of aid. It's well known that Hamas stole all the money and the aid for themselves to build tunnels and buy weapons and so on. So economic reconstruction, I'm afraid, unless it's overseen properly by the right people, actually just rearms other factions. Working with emerging cooperative forces in the international system. So what we're talking about here is the UN, NATO, and the European Union. Well, working with NATO, that's got value. The EU, you have to excuse here in Britain, we're not big fans of the EU. Some are, some aren't. We're not a member of it. But the United Nations, I actually have written 1 or 2 articles about the United Nations that you can get to later if you want sometime or other. The United Nations has really failed in its purposes. It is not fit for purpose, and its bias against Israel can hardly be believed. The next thing is just peacemaking theory is to strengthen the United Nations. So we can leave that one. Reduce offensive weapons and trade. Would you like to explain that to Turkey and Iran? I think I'll just leave that there. Engage grassroots peacemaking groups involved in associations. I think we've spoke about. But the impressive array of non-government offices working on human rights, civil society and peacemaking around the world supposedly exist to help both governments and the citizens create a more just and peaceful world. Paul Schroeder, the eminent diplomatic historian and professor at the University of Illinois, said, "This makes just peacekeeping into a task for action by ordinary citizens individually and in groups to sustain, criticise, goad, influence, reform, and lead the many kinds of voluntary associations, governmental and private, which can contribute to transcending the contradictions and managing and overcoming conflicts of an anarchic nature." Non-government officials and offices. I had the privilege of working in Ethiopia before the Civil War, during the Civil War, and after the Civil War. And the biggest, most impressive in Addis Ababa, the 5+ star hotels there, and the luxury apartment blocks and everything belong to NGOs. And people are starving to death a few miles outside Addis. We'll leave that there. Now, this is the important thing. Transforming initiatives. And this is my suggestion, which I'm afraid we'll have to come to next time. But what I'm going to say is this. I'm just going to say this. Just peacemaking theory is full of naivety, ideology, and lacks reality. Dennis Jett said this. Peacekeeping and conflicts to which it is applied have evolved since the United Nations began these things in 1948. Although there is no mention of peacekeeping in the Charter of the United Nations, the organisation was only 3 years old when it launched its first intervention. I want to leave this with you to think about as a last word. More than 1 million men and women from 125 countries have served in 71 missions around the world. Today, the UN has 90,000 peacekeepers deployed around the world in 12 operations that cost the international community $6.5 billion a year. Half of these missions have been going on for a combined total of 3 centuries, with no solution in sight. The 3 centuries he has put together, for each conflict, with no solution in sight to any of them. 5 of the remaining 6 are in response to violent extremism. In those missions, a steadily growing number of peacekeepers have been killed, despite the fact they were unable to make any significant contribution to successfully combating extremists. UN peacekeeping has therefore become either endless or impossible, and the peacekeepers have had neither the courage nor the stick to make any effect whatsoever. Peacemakers or peacekeepers. I'm going to leave you to ponder on this one, and when I come back, I'm going to give you what I consider is a solution to conflict. So I'd just like to think about these things. We live in a world of war. The United Nations is useless and unnecessary and morally bankrupt. But on a positive note, Jesus has something really interesting to teach us about these things. So, may the Lord shalom, the real peace, with you and those you love until we meet again.